The night was cold and quiet, the kind of night that pressed against the windows and made every sound seem too loud, the kind of night that made even the crickets hold their breath. Thomas lay in bed, half awake, his candle burned low, its flame shaking as if afraid of its own light. The plantation house was still, no footsteps, no laughter, only the sigh of old wood and the whisper of wind under the door. Then came the knock, soft but sharp enough to make his eyes open wide. He waited, thinking he had imagined it, that it was just the wind playing tricks. But it came again, 3 slow knocks, each one louder. Deliberate, alive, he sat up and called out, but no one answered. The sound of his own voice felt strange in the quiet. He took the candle and walked to the door. The floorboards creaked beneath his bare feet when he opened the door. The cold night air rushed in and wrapped around him like a ghost's breath. And she stood there, small, thin, barefoot, her hair tangled and wet from the grass, her dress torn at the hem, her feet muddy, but her eyes were burning, not from fear, from something deeper, something fierce and heavy. She didn't beg or cry. She didn't look up at him like others did. She just stared straight into his eyes and said, "He killed my mama in the barn." Her voice didn't shake. It didn't rise or fall. It was flat, steady, honest, and the way she said it made his skin crawl because there was no doubt in her words. Only truth, the kind that doesn't need proof. Thomas felt his heart pound once hard in his chest. He looked past her shoulder into the night. The field stretched out into darkness, the moon low behind a thick layer of cloud, and at the far edge of the field stood the barn, tall and black against the horizon. The lanterns were out, no horses inside, no movement, just a still, silent shape. For years, everyone had said the barn held something, a story no one wanted to tell, a place people avoided once the sun went down. He'd heard the whispers as a boy but had laughed them off, calling them slave tales meant to keep children in line. But seeing the girl now, seeing the way her chest rose and fell, the way her lips trembled after she'd spoken, he knew this wasn't a tale. He opened the door wider and said quietly, "Come inside." She didn't move. She shook her head. Her eyes flicked toward the barn and back again. "He's watching," she whispered, and Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine. He looked out again but saw nothing. "Only the heavy dark," he said her name softly. But she didn't answer. Maybe she didn't want to. Maybe she didn't have one anymore. She just stood there like part of the night itself. He swallowed hard and said, "Who?" Though deep down, he already knew what she would say. The silence stretched long before she spoke again. "Your father." The words hit him like a slap. He blinked, stepped back, shook his head. "That's not true," he said, but his voice cracked halfway. She didn't argue, she just lowered her eyes. "He killed my mama in the barn," she repeated, softer this time, almost like a prayer, and turned to go. Thomas reached out instinctively, but his hand stopped before it touched her. The air around her felt strange, heavy, the kind of air that carried too much memory. She took 2 steps back into the dark and whispered, "You'll see," before she vanished down the path toward the fields. He stood in the doorway long after she disappeared, the wind moving through the trees like breath through teeth, the barn's dark outline standing against the sky. The more he looked at it, the less it looked like a building and the more it looked like a wound. He closed the door slowly, the latch clicking like a heartbeat. But sleep never came again. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face, those eyes full of fire and pain, those words looping in his mind. "He killed my mama in the barn." Before dawn he was up again, sitting by the window with his coat on, staring across the fields. The fog was rising, crawling across the grass, and the barn seemed closer somehow, like it had moved during the night. The crows sat on the roof still and watching. His coffee went cold untouched when the first light of morning brushed the world in gray. He decided he couldn't pretend anymore. Something in that barn was calling. Not with sound, but with weight. A pull in the chest. He opened the door and stepped into the cold morning air. His boots sank into the damp soil as he walked. The path between the fields felt longer than it ever had. The house behind him faded. The barn grew bigger, more real, its wood black with age, streaks of dried rain down the sides. The lock on the door old but still strong. He stopped at the edge and listened. Nothing. Just the slow hum of insects waking with the sun, but he could feel something else beneath it. A rhythm, almost like breathing. The girl's words echoed in his head again. "He killed my mama in the barn." He told himself it couldn't be true. His father had been a hard man, yes, but a fair one. That's what everyone said. He had built this land. He had raised men and horses and a name worth respect. That's what Thomas had always believed, but belief cracked easy under truth. He took a breath and reached out to touch the door. The wood was colder than it should have been under sunlight. It felt damp, alive. His fingers traced grooves and scratches he didn't remember being there. Lines carved deep like claw marks. He stepped back, pulled his hand away, rubbed his fingers on his coat and saw a faint smear of something dark. Old dried, he didn't want to think what it might be. The barn door groaned faintly in the wind, the sound almost like a voice. He turned back toward the house but stopped halfway, because there, at the edge of the field near the tree line, stood the girl again. She wasn't moving, just standing and watching him. The same bare feet, the same torn dress, her eyes locked on him and the barn behind him. He lifted a hand as if to call out, but before he could speak, she raised her arm slowly and pointed at the barn, then dropped her hand and was gone. He blinked hard, looked again. Nothing, just fog. He walked back toward the barn without meaning to, every part of him screaming to stop, but something else, something stronger, kept pushing him forward, maybe guilt, maybe curiosity, maybe the voice of the truth he'd never wanted to hear. He stopped at the door again, pressed his hand to the latch, and whispered, "What did you do, Father?" The door gave a low creak like an answer, and he pulled it open. The smell hit him first, not fresh hay or wood, but something sour, thick, and old. He held his breath and stepped inside. The light from his lantern spread across the walls, showing ropes, hooks, stains too dark to be dirt. The air felt heavier here, harder to breathe. He turned slowly, his eyes catching on an old stool, broken, lying near a beam. He bent down and picked up something small beside it. A button, old, rusted around the edges with a thread still attached, and for a moment in his mind he saw fingers pulling it from a dress, saw a flash of fear in someone's eyes. He dropped it, his heart racing. The sound of it hitting the floor echoed too loud in the silence. Then he heard it, faint but clear, a whisper. "Thomas." He froze, turned fast, but the barn was empty. Just hay and dust. He backed away slowly, every nerve screaming. The whisper came again, closer now. "Thomas." It was a woman's voice, soft, broken, full of sorrow. He felt something cold brush his arm and he stumbled back toward the door. But when he reached it, it was closed, the latch down. He pulled hard, it wouldn't move. The lantern flame trembled. Shadows danced up the walls, long and twisting like arms reaching. "Who's there?" He shouted, but his voice sounded small. The whisper came again, not from one place, but from everywhere. "He killed me." The lantern shook in his hand. The sound of chains rattled from above, and in that moment, he understood the truth wasn't just buried in this barn, it was awake. It had been waiting, and it wanted to be heard. The cold air thickened, his breath visible in the dim light. And outside, through the cracks in the boards, the faint shape of the girl stood again, still silent, her eyes glowing faint in the dark. She raised her hand and pointed at the ground. Her lips moved, but no sound came. He followed her gaze and saw the dirt beneath his boots was uneven, disturbed as if something had been buried there not long ago. His knees weakened, the world spun. The whisper came one last time. "He killed my mama in the barn." And the light went out, the barn swallowed everything. And Thomas realized this night wasn't the start of a story, it was the end of one. The end his father had written long ago in blood and silence, and now, the truth had come knocking. The fog hung heavy over the fields, the kind of thick gray that swallowed the moonlight and turned everything into a shape that couldn't be trusted. Thomas walked with the lantern in his hand, its weak glow trembling like it wanted to give up. The path from the house to the barn had never felt so long before. The cold air clung to his skin like damp cloth. Every step he took sank into soft mud that sucked at his boots. Behind him, the house looked smaller, almost like it didn't belong to him anymore, like it was watching him leave and refusing to follow. Ahead, the barn stood silent at the edge of the plantation, tall and black against the pale fog, a shadow with no shape, a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. The wind picked up just enough to move the dry branches near the fence, and they scratched the wood like fingernails on a coffin. The girl was already there, waiting, standing barefoot in the dirt as if the cold didn't touch her. Her dress hung loose on her shoulders. Her hair stuck to her neck, but her eyes didn't blink. She stared at the barn with the look of someone who had stood before it too many times, someone who had heard things no one should ever hear. Thomas tried to speak, but the words stuck somewhere deep in his throat. He wanted to ask why she came to him, why she told him why tonight, but the fog pressed against his mouth like a hand. When she finally looked at him, it wasn't like a girl looking at a man. It was like someone looking at a wall that was finally cracking. Her small hand lifted and she pointed at the barn, then lowered it. "You hear it too now," she whispered. But Thomas didn't answer. He didn't want to admit that she was right, that he had heard something last night in the dark. A whisper he'd tried to blame on his dreams, a name that slid under the door like smoke. The path creaked under their feet. The wood boards that led to the main door of the barn always groaned a little, but tonight the sound was deeper, longer, almost alive. The dogs at the far end of the property barked once and then went silent, like they knew better than to be heard here. A crow flapped its wings from the barn roof, its cry cutting the air like a blade and then disappearing into the fog. Thomas clenched his jaw. It's just a building, he told himself in a whisper, but it didn't sound convincing even to his own ears. The girl tilted her head slightly, almost like she heard him. "No," she said softly. "It's not." He stopped walking, stared at her, and for a brief second he thought her breath fogged the air differently. Slower, colder, heavier. She walked past him and stepped onto the wood boards, barefoot and silent. The lantern light caught her shadow on the ground, but the strange thing was how her shadow seemed longer than her, stretching toward the barn door like it wanted to go inside before she did. Thomas followed her because not following her felt worse. The barn loomed larger with each step, its wooden panels stained dark with age, its roof slightly bowed like it carried too many secrets. The big double doors were shut, but one corner of the left panel had a crack wide enough for cold air to pour through. The air around the barn was different from the rest of the field. Colder, sharper, like a winter that belonged only to this patch of ground. He could see the girl's hair lift slightly with the wind, though his own clothes lay still. She stopped in front of the door and didn't move. Thomas came up beside her, and for the first time he realized she wasn't shivering. She wasn't afraid the way she should have been. It was him who felt his stomach tighten and his hands grow slick with sweat despite the cold. He turned his lantern toward the door and the light hit the wood, revealing faint lines carved along the edges. Deep scratches that didn't look like something done with a knife. They looked like fingernails. Hundreds of them, layered over each other, desperate marks of something or someone trying to get out. His breath caught in his throat. The girl leaned forward slightly and whispered so quietly he almost missed it. "It remembers." Thomas stepped back. "What?" he asked. But she didn't answer. She just kept looking at the door like it was a mouth about to open. A crow caught again and flew away, its wings slicing the air as if escaping from something unseen. Thomas rubbed his arms to chase away the cold, but it didn't help. The cold here wasn't outside his body, it was inside, the kind of chill that builds when a truth is too close. The girl knelt suddenly and ran her fingers over the bottom edge of the door. She brushed away mud and straw, and Thomas saw something shine faintly, a rusted metal piece buried half in the dirt. She pulled it out with small, sure hands, and when it came free, he saw what it was, a broken lock, its shape twisted, edges dark with old stains, the kind of thing that wasn't cut open, but forced open, maybe from the inside. She looked up at him with wide eyes, and for the first time since the night began, she looked a little like a child. "It wasn't locked," she said, her voice quiet and heavy. Thomas stared at the metal in her hands and felt the barn pressing against them both like a living thing. He wanted to leave, to turn around and run back to the warm house with its walls and its polite lies, but the path behind him already felt too far, too thin, too weak. The fog curled around the barn like fingers. The girl placed the broken lock at the base of the door, like an offering, and stood up slowly. "He used to come here at night," she said, her voice almost distant. "He told everyone to stay away. He said it was for the horses, but there were no horses." Thomas felt his heart pounding in his throat now. "Who?" he asked, even though he already knew. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. "Your father," she whispered, and that single word cracked something deep in him. The sound of her voice made the barn groan, a low sound that seemed to rise from inside its ribs. He stared at the door, suddenly certain that it knew his name. The fog swirled tighter. The lantern flame danced wildly even though the air was still. The girl took a small step toward the door and the wood answered with a slow creak, like something inside had been waiting for her. For him, for this exact night, he whispered, "Don't." But she didn't stop. She pressed her hand flat against the door, and in that moment Thomas swore the wood pulsed beneath her fingers like it was breathing. He stumbled back one step and the girl turned her head slightly. Her voice calm, too calm, the barn never forgets. And before he could speak, the door let out a low, shuddering groan, the kind that felt like the ground itself was shifting. The girl lowered her hand and stepped back, not running, not scared, just waiting. Thomas stared at the door, and in that silence, in that moment, he knew. Whatever secret this place held had been waiting for him. Not just anyone, him. The son of the man who had built it. The boy who had grown up pretending he couldn't hear the whispers. The man who could no longer run, and the barn, tall and dark, loomed before him like a mouth ready to speak his family's sins out loud. The door creaked louder when Thomas placed his hand on it. The sound deep and long like a groan coming from the belly of something old, something that had been waiting. The wood was cold under his palm, not the kind of cold that came from the night air, but the kind that came from inside, the kind that made the blood in his fingertips ache. He pushed and the heavy barn door moved slow, resisting him as if something inside was holding it shut. The girl didn't help. She just stood beside him, her eyes fixed on the gap opening between the panels, her breath steady, too steady for someone her age. As the door finally opened wide enough for him to step in, a thick wave of air poured out, heavy and stale. It smelled of old hay, wet wood, rust, and something else underneath. Something sour and dark, something human. The lantern light flickered and bent back like it didn't want to go any further. Thomas swallowed hard and stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath his boots. Not the light creak of dry wood, but a slow, deep sound, like the floor was remembering every step that had ever walked on it. The barn swallowed sound. Even his breathing seemed too loud. The only light was from his lantern, a trembling golden circle surrounded by thick black. The girl stayed at the doorway, her body frozen, her toes on the edge of the threshold but not 1 inch beyond it. Her voice broke the silence, soft and thin but sharp as a blade. "That's where she died," she said, pointing toward the center of the barn floor. Thomas followed her hand and saw it. A darker patch of wood in the middle of the barn, not black, not red, just wrong. A shade that didn't belong to the rest of the floor, as if the wood itself had soaked something it could never let go of. His lantern shook slightly as he lifted it higher. Shadows crawled across the walls like long black fingers. The old beam stretched up into the darkness above. Hay clung to them like cobwebs. Every shadow moved wrong, not like shadows should. They moved like they remembered pain. Thomas tried to tell himself it was just his imagination, that the fog outside had already put fear into his bones. But then something brushed his shoulder, quick and soft like a hand passing through air. He spun around fast, but there was no one behind him, just the door half open and the girl's wide eyes staring past him into the barn. "Don't go too far," she whispered, and the way she said it made his stomach twist. She wasn't warning him like a child who was scared. She was warning him like someone who had seen someone else disappear in here before. Thomas forced himself to turn back to the center of the barn. His boots pressed down into straw and old dirt. He heard the faint sound of a chain swinging, slow and lazy, like someone had touched it. The lantern caught a glimpse of it, a rusted chain hanging from a thick beam above, its hook black and bent, and though no wind blew inside, the chain swayed back and forth as if moved by unseen hands. Thomas lifted the light higher and saw marks on the beam, gouges deep and uneven like something or someone had struggled there. His throat tightened, the lantern shook harder. Shadows twisted into strange shapes on the walls, and his heartbeat hammered against his ribs like a fist. He tried to call out, to say something to the girl, but his voice stuck. The girl's reflection flickered across the shadowed floor like a ghost. Her small hands clenched at her sides. She pointed again, not at the chain this time, but at the floor beneath it. Thomas lowered the lantern and knelt slowly. The wood was uneven here. Old soft in places like rot had chewed through it. He ran his fingers over it and felt grooves carved into the boards. They were narrow and deep, like the marks of fingernails dragged in panic. His breath came shorter now. The air in the barn grew heavier the longer he stayed, like breathing through a soaked cloth. And then he heard it, faint at first, like a sound under the floor. A slow tap, 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 steady, too slow to be a mouse, too sharp to be wood settling. It came from under that dark patch. Thomas backed up quickly, his lantern beam shaking across the floor. He whispered to the girl, "Who's down there?" But she didn't answer. She didn't move. She just stared at the floor and whispered so softly he almost didn't hear her. "It's not who. It's what he left." The tapping stopped all at once, and the silence that followed was worse. It pressed against his ears like a weight, a silence that wanted to be heard. The barn door behind him creaked but didn't close. It just swayed slightly, like someone unseen had brushed past it. Thomas's pulse raced. He turned and took a step toward the door, but the girl shook her head, her lips pale. "You can't leave now," she said, and for the first time her voice trembled. "Once it feels you, it won't let go." Thomas looked back at the floor, at the dark patch that now looked like it was breathing. Faint, almost invisible, but real, the wood moved, rising just a little with each breath like the barn itself had lungs. The chain above gave a sharp jerk, a single movement, fast and sudden, like something had pulled on it. Thomas stumbled back, hitting the wall. The lantern swung wildly, its light catching something carved into the beam beside him. Words scratched deep, words that looked old but sharp. "Forgive us," the letters were uneven. Carved by desperate hands, not by tools. His father's voice echoed in his head without sound. Not memory, not warmth, just something cold. A reminder of the man who had built this barn and told him never to enter it after dark. Never ask why. Never look too close. Thomas looked up at the chain again, at the hook that swayed on its own, and for the first time in his life he felt like the building itself was watching him, like the walls had eyes and the floor had a mouth. He tried to steady his breathing, but it only made the pounding louder in his ears. The girl whispered something again, her voice a thread through the heavy air. She begged him. Thomas froze, turned to her. What? She didn't blink. She begged him to stop. The barn creaked as if agreeing. A sound that started at the roof and rolled down through the beams into the floor. The lantern light dimmed for no reason, as if the air had swallowed it. And Thomas realized he wasn't standing in a room. He was standing in the middle of a wound, a place that had never healed. The tapping under the floor returned, louder this time, moving slowly toward where he stood, and the girl's voice broke the dark one more time. Calm but colder now. This is where the truth lives. The lantern flame flickered as Thomas turned in slow circles, the air inside the barn growing heavier with every breath he took. The shadows moved in a way that shadows shouldn't, twisting long and thin across the walls as if they had their own pulse. The sound of the wind outside vanished completely, and the silence pressed down on him like wet cloth. Then without warning, the barn door slammed shut behind him with a loud, sharp crack that echoed through the beams like a gunshot. Thomas spun around, his heart pounding so hard it made his ribs ache. He rushed to the door and grabbed the handle, pulling hard, but it didn't budge. The wood felt warm now, not cold like before, warm like the breath of something alive. The girl still stood outside, but now her face was pale and her hands gripped the doorframe as if something invisible was pushing her away. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Her eyes were wide, fixed on something behind him. Thomas turned slowly. The chain hanging from the beam above was swinging fast now. Though there was no wind, no movement, only the creak, creak, creak of rusted metal. The sound was too steady, too deliberate, like it was moving to a heartbeat that wasn't his. He lifted the lantern higher and the shadows stretched up toward the rafters, and that was when he saw it. Faint handprints on the wooden pillars, small, pale, smeared as if someone had grabbed them over and over again, climbing nowhere, falling again and again. His breathing turned shallow. The walls of the barn seemed to bend slightly inward, like the place itself wanted to swallow him whole. Then came the whisper, soft at first, like air brushing past his ear. Thomas. He froze. The voice was soft. A woman's voice, but broken, as if it had traveled too far through the dark. Thomas. It came again, closer now, from everywhere and nowhere. He backed up until his shoulders hit the locked door. The lantern flame trembled as if it too was afraid. He shouted, "Who's there?" But his voice cracked and was swallowed by the dark. The whisper turned into breathing, slow and low, coming from the corner of the barn where the shadows were the thickest. The girl's face outside twisted in terror. She began to bang on the door with both hands, but even that sound came through muffled, like the barn was holding it back. Thomas forced himself to step forward, the sound of his boots scraping against the floor louder than the beating of his heart. And the whisper changed. Not one voice now, but many, low and layered, overlapping each other, saying his name, saying other names, names he didn't know but somehow felt. His father's voice mixed somewhere inside that chorus, soft and cruel at once. The lantern light hit the far wall and revealed scratches carved deep into the wood. Dozens, maybe hundreds, some long, some short, some with fingernail marks at the ends, as if people had tried to claw their way out. The whispering stopped suddenly, replaced by the sound of footsteps on the loft above him. Slow, careful, not the sound of rats, not creaks of old wood, but footsteps, heavy enough to make the beams above groan. He lifted the lantern upward, the light hitting the edge of the loft. Nothing there, only darkness, but the footsteps didn't stop. They circled slowly, measured. The girl screamed something outside, her voice sharp, but he couldn't hear the words clearly. Like the air between them was too thick. He tried again to push the door open, but it didn't even shake. It was as if the barn itself was holding it closed, like the wood had locked itself. He turned again toward the dark corner and the lantern flame flared suddenly, lighting the rafters, and there in the far back something moved. Quick and small like a flash of cloth, he staggered back, his heel hitting the uneven floorboards near the center, the same place the girl had pointed to, the same place where the wood didn't look right. His foot sank slightly into the soft patch and he froze. The whisper came right at his ear this time, so close it felt like someone's mouth was inches from his skin. Down there, he jumped and stumbled away. The chain above jerked so hard it snapped against the beam. Dust fell from the ceiling in thick lines, The whisper rose again, louder, mixed with low cries. The kind of sound people make when they are choking on their last breath? Thomas's stomach turned cold, sweat running down his spine despite the chill. He dropped to his knees and pressed his hand against the uneven floor. And for the first time he felt it clearly. The wood was moving, breathing. Something under it moved too, slow and wet like mud sliding against itself. The girl's voice finally pierced the air, loud and raw. "Thomas, it's not the wind." And in that moment the lantern flickered violently and almost went out. He grabbed it tight, his breath ragged, his pulse thundering. The whispers rose higher now, overlapping each other, calling names, begging, crying, laughing in strange broken bursts, and somewhere in all that noise was his father's voice again, low and calm. The same way it used to sound when he told bedtime stories, but now it said something else, something cold. "You shouldn't have come here." Thomas whispered his father's name, not knowing why, and the whisper in the dark whispered it back, perfectly, exactly like him. The door behind him rattled but didn't open. The girl was screaming now, her fists pounding against the wood, but the barn didn't care. It was awake, it was alive, and it was holding him inside. The footsteps above grew louder, heavier, circling like a predator that had already chosen its prey. Thomas clenched the lantern tighter, the metal handle digging into his palm. His breathing shallow as his heart slammed against his ribs. The whispering around him no longer floated softly. It crawled low and sharp, like dozens of voices tangled together in the walls. The chain hanging from the beam snapped upward again, not like something pushed it, but like something had pulled from above. And then slowly it stopped moving, freezing midair as if an invisible hand held it there. The girl outside screamed his name again, but her voice was a faint echo, like she was miles away even though the door was only a few feet behind him. Thomas's eyes flicked back to the uneven floor, to the dark patch where the wood looked wrong. The breathing sound came from under it now, wet and slow like something waking up. The whispers slid together until they became a single voice. A woman's voice, clear this time, full of pain. "Down here," it said, soft, coaxing, almost gentle. The sound slid under his skin like ice water. He stumbled back, but his boots caught on something. A metal ring sticking out from the floor, rusted, small, half buried in the wood as if meant to be hidden, as if meant to be found only by someone who knew where to look. He stared at it and felt a wave of nausea crawl through him. The lantern's light flickered weakly, and as it brightened for one brief second, he saw it clearly. It wasn't just a metal ring. It was a latch, a hidden hatch. The whisper came again. "Open it," he shook his head, whispering. "No." But his hand was already reaching for it without him wanting it to. His fingers trembled as they closed around the cold iron. The floor felt warm beneath it. Too warm, like the breath of something trapped. The girl's muffled voice pushed through the door. "Don't touch it," she screamed. But the voice from below was closer, sweeter, whispering his name like a song. Thomas. The wood under his feet creaked in rhythm with his pulse. The latch groaned when he pulled it, as if something beneath the floor didn't want to be disturbed. And then the hatch gave way with a long, slow moan. The air that rushed out hit him like a slap, thick, foul, warm, a smell that was neither animal nor rot alone. It was older, deeper, human. His knees went weak as the lantern light spilled down into the black pit beneath. He expected empty dirt, maybe old tools, maybe nothing at all. But what the light revealed made his skin crawl and his breath lock in his chest. Bones, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, tangled in chains. Some still wearing the shredded remains of dresses and shirts. Small bones and big bones mixed together like a grave dug by a monster with no mercy. The walls of the pit were scratched, fingernail marks carved into the hard wood, long streaks of panic frozen in time. Thomas's stomach twisted. Beale burned the back of his throat, he whispered. "No." But the truth didn't care. The girl outside began pounding on the door harder now, her screams growing frantic. "Close it! Close it!" But he couldn't move. Something in that pit had him by the throat, not with hands but with memory, with blood. He knew it deep down, without anyone telling him. These weren't strangers. These were people his father had buried here. People no one spoke of. People erased from the world and locked in the dark. The whispers rose again, no longer soft but sharp, furious, layered all around him. "Thomas," they cried, over and over, some pleading, some cursing, some begging for air they no longer had. The chain above his head snapped downward and slammed into the floor next to him with a loud metallic crack. Dust exploded around his boots. He stumbled back and almost fell into the pit. The lantern tilted, light shaking wildly over skulls and empty sockets staring up at him like a jury waiting for a verdict. The woman's voice came again, louder. "He killed us." Thomas shook his head, covering his ears. "No, not me," but the whispers hissed back. "His blood. Your blood." The girl's voice outside cracked into a scream. "They won't let you go." The floorboards under him groaned like something was shifting, like hands were pushing from below. The shadows stretched higher. The beam above trembled. A single drop of something warm and wet landed on his cheek. He looked up and saw nothing but the beam, but the air smelled of copper. The past itself pressing down on him. A memory he never lived but carried in his blood. He stepped back against the wall, his mind spinning. The girl's fist hit the door again. "Thomas, don't look at them!" But it was too late. The lantern light hit the center of the pit where the bones were thickest. And there, curled between them, was a shape. Not quite solid, not quite shadow. Long fingers clutched the chains like they belonged to them. A head tilted slowly upward, and a pair of hollow eyes met his. The whispers stopped all at once, replaced by a low, wet sound like something exhaling after a long time. Thomas's grip on the lantern tightened until his knuckles turned white. He wanted to run, but the door didn't move. The girl outside was crying now, her voice broken and terrified. "They know who you are," she shouted. And as the figure in the pit slowly started to rise, its movement slow and deliberate, Thomas felt something deep and cold bloom in his chest. Not from the barn, not from the whispers, but from inside himself, because for the first time in his life, he knew the girl was right. The barn wasn't just a place of death. It was a grave of a secret that belonged to his bloodline, and it had just woken up. Thomas stumbled backward, his boots sliding on the dusty floor as the thing in the pit rose higher, its shape a blur between shadow and bone. The lantern flame shook wildly as if the air itself had turned into a storm trapped inside the barn. The whispers returned all at once, louder, sharper, hundreds of voices crawling up the walls, crawling into his head, calling his name over and over like a curse. "Thomas, Thomas, Thomas," they hissed, some in pain, some in fury, some in laughter that didn't sound human anymore. The hatch creaked under pressure as if something far bigger was trying to pull itself out. His hands shook so hard the lantern almost slipped from his grip. The girl outside was screaming his name now, not with fear of the dark, but with the kind of fear that comes from already knowing how the story ends. "Run," she screamed. "They're not coming for me, they're coming for you." The air around him grew thick, hot, and wet, like standing next to a fever that didn't belong to a living body. The chains above him rattled without wind, slamming against the beams with sharp, angry snaps. The shadows on the wall twisted and stretched until they no longer looked like shadows at all, but figures, dozens of them, long arms reaching, heads tilting, mouths open in silent screams. Thomas pressed his back against the door, pulling at the latch again, but it wouldn't move. It was like the wood itself was alive and determined to keep him inside. The thing in the pit rose higher. Its fingers were long, thin, and bent like branches that had been broken too many times. Its face was hollow, its eye sockets wide and empty but staring straight at him like it knew his soul. Its mouth opened, slow and wet, and the sound that came out wasn't a scream. It was the sound of chains tightening, of dirt being shoveled, of someone breathing their last breath under the weight of someone else's cruelty. "His blood," the voice rasped. Not just one voice, but many, layered together. "Your blood." The walls of the barn groaned like they might crack under the weight of it all. The lantern flickered and went dim. The only light left came from the faint glow of the hatch, a sickly pale light leaking out of the pit like the ground itself had started to bleed. Thomas screamed at the door, slammed his shoulder against it, but the wood didn't even creak. The girl outside yelled something he couldn't fully hear. It was drowned by the whispers inside. They were closer now, not in the air but in his ears, inside his skull, whispering names he didn't know, showing him flashes that weren't his memories, but his father's. The barn filled with laughter, his father's voice calm, cold and smooth, the sound of a lock clicking, the sound of rope stretching, the sound of a woman's scream tearing through the night and being buried in silence. Thomas squeezed his eyes shut and shook his head. No, I'm not him," but the voices laughed. Not cruel, just certain. "Blood remembers," they hissed. "Blood pays." His father's shape appeared in the shadows for a heartbeat standing at the far end of the barn, tall, wearing that same coat, that same look, and Thomas nearly dropped the lantern as the ghost of his father turned and stared at him, its mouth twisting into a smile that didn't belong to a man. "You came," the shadow said without moving its lips, and the thing in the pit answered with a scream, high and long, a sound that shattered the silence like glass. The hatch blew open wider, wood splintering around the edges, dirt bursting into the air. Thomas stumbled to the side, coughing, choking. The shadows surged forward, brushing against his skin like cold hands dragging him down. The chain from above whipped downward, wrapping itself around his wrist so fast he didn't even see it coming. The metal was freezing and bit into his flesh. Pulling tight, his heart slammed against his ribs. He pulled back with everything he had, but the chain didn't budge. It yanked him forward toward the pit like an invisible hand was reeling him in. The figure was almost fully out now. Its body, not one shape but many, like the barn floor itself, was coughing up every soul it had swallowed. Faces flickering over its skin, eyes opening and closing like trapped memories. The girl outside screamed again, banging the door so hard the wood cracked. "Thomas! It wants him," she screamed, and he finally understood what she meant. It wasn't just some random haunting. It was personal, this thing, these souls. They were tied to his blood, to the man who had built this barn, the man who had used it to bury his sins, and now it was reaching for the next link in the chain. Thomas dragged his feet against the floor, splinters cutting into his palms as he fought against the chain. The figure leaned closer to the edge of the pit, its head tilting, its empty eyes glowing faint and pale. Its mouth opened wide, and Thomas could hear the sound of every scream ever buried in this place. They weren't just echoes, they were alive, wrapped around his name. His skin crawled, his chest tightened, and he realized with sickening clarity that he could hear his father's voice inside those screams, whispering his name like he belonged down there too. "Thomas," the figure rasped. "Come home." He let out a raw cry and pulled so hard the chain snapped against the beam above. Sending a shower of dust into the air, he fell backward, hitting the wall hard. But before he could stand, the floorboards began to crack, long thin lines running outward from the hatch like veins. The entire barn shook, groaning like a dying animal. The shadows surged again. Wrapping around the walls, the pit glowed brighter, the thing inside dragging itself out with long, jerking motions. And for the first time, Thomas saw it clearly. A body made of bones, chains, rotted flesh, and darkness. But what froze him wasn't its shape. It was the fact that its hands looked exactly like his father's. The barn trembled like a living creature waking from a long nightmare. Dust poured down from the rafters, the air thick with the smell of earth and blood and rust. Thomas's hands clawed at the wall behind him as the thing pulled itself fully from the pit. Its form wrong and shifting, a body made of bones and chains and shadows. Faces flickered across it like trapped screams trying to claw their way free, mouths opening and closing soundlessly before vanishing again into the black. Its fingers stretched toward him, long and thin and too human. Too much like the hands of the man he had spent his entire life trying to believe was good. The man whose smile was carved into his memory like a blade. The man who built this barn, who buried what he didn't want the world to see, and now those sins had risen from the ground to collect. The chain around Thomas's wrist tightened again with a sudden snap, digging into his skin like teeth, pulling him forward toward the pit. The floor groaned as the boards cracked under the weight of something that should not exist. The whispers returned in a violent rush. Not whispers anymore, but a chorus of screams and moans and cries for air. Cries for help that had never come. "Thomas," they hissed, "your blood, your sin. Your turn." His father's voice was loudest, clear and steady, the way it used to sound when he called him in from the fields as a boy. "Son," the shadow hissed, and hearing that word in this place was like a knife sliding between his ribs. Thomas screamed back, "I'm not you!" But the shadows only laughed, the sound cracking through the barn like bones breaking. The girl outside kept slamming against the door, the wood splintering, her voice raw with desperation. "Thomas, fight it. It's your blood, but not your fate. Fight it." But he could barely hear her. The voices inside his head were too loud. The faces swirling on the creature's body turned toward him, their empty sockets like mouths, and then the creature lunged, its hand slamming into the floor, dragging itself closer with a wet, bone-snapping sound. The chains rattled like an army of ghosts marching behind it. Thomas screamed and pulled against the metal, biting into his wrist. He dug his heels into the broken wood, splinters stabbing through his boots, but the pull was relentless. Like the ground itself was swallowing him into a grave dug long before he was born. The creature tilted its head, its face splitting into two, then three, each mouth moving with the same words in unison. "He built this for us. He built this for you." Thomas shook his head violently. "No." But the voices kept coming. "Your father's sins don't stay buried," they hissed. "They wait for your blood." And with that, the chain yanked hard, dragging him a few feet closer to the pit. The lantern fell from his grip, shattering against the floor, the flame spilling out, flickering weakly but not catching fire. The barn seemed to drink the light, swallowing it into its walls like it wanted nothing bright in this place. The girl's screams grew sharper. She kicked the door again and again, finally splintering one of the panels, and her face appeared through the crack, her eyes wide with terror but burning with a stubborn fire. "Thomas, listen to me. They can't take what you don't give them. You're not him." The voices hissed louder, twisting her words into something dark. "He is. He always will be." The creature rose taller now, half its body out of the pit, chains dragging like the sound of metal coffins being opened. Its hand reached for his chest, not to kill, but to pull him down into the earth, to make him part of the thing, part of the secret, part of the curse. Thomas's mind filled with images that weren't his. Flashes of his father standing where he stood, dragging people into the dark. The screams, the silence afterward, the door closing, the soil being covered again and again. A ritual of cruelty. And Thomas saw clearly that this thing was not just a ghost. It was a memory made real, a history that never died, and he was standing at the end of a bloodline built on its back. He screamed, not in fear this time but in rage, and slammed his other hand down on the chain around his wrist. The metal burned cold, but he didn't stop. He pulled and twisted until the rusted links cut into his palm. Blood dripping onto the floorboards, the creature shrieked, the sound so loud the barn itself shook. The windows shattered. The door burst open a little wider. The girl threw her shoulder into it and screamed his name again. He didn't hear her voice anymore, just felt it cutting through the noise like a knife. The creature lunged again, but Thomas met its pull with everything left in him. His voice raw as he roared into the darkness. "I am not him," and the chain snapped with a violent crack that echoed through the beams like a gunshot. The creature reeled back. The whispers faltered for a moment, like the storm had stuttered. The ground shook and the walls groaned. The pit glowed brighter. The thing screamed with 1,000 voices. A scream that didn't come from lungs but from earth and blood and years of silence. Thomas stumbled backward as the girl finally forced the door open wide enough to squeeze through. She grabbed his arm with small, strong hands. "Run!" she shouted. And they turned just as the creature reached upward, its fingers grazing his boot. The floor beneath them split open like a mouth, the pit collapsing in on itself, the barn howling as if it was alive, beams snapping one by one like bones breaking. Thomas and the girl threw themselves out the door as the roof caved in behind them. The sound like thunder ripping through the night. They fell into the wet grass, choking on the cold air, the ground trembling beneath them as if the earth itself was trying to bury the last of the monster it had held for too long. The barn sagged inward, groaning before it finally went silent. The whispers fading like smoke blown away by wind. Thomas lay on his back staring at the night sky, shaking, his wrist raw and bleeding. His chest heaving, the girl knelt beside him, her eyes fixed on the ruins of the barn. "It's not gone," she whispered. "It never really goes away." Thomas turned his head slowly, the wind moving through the broken beams. And for one brief moment he swore he heard his father's voice again, soft and calm. "Blood remembers." And then it was gone, carried off into the dark, leaving only the silence of a secret finally broken open but never truly dead.